Trinity is devotion. And this is a wonderful intent because it doesn't just help us get closer to God and therefore assist us along the Christian path, which ultimately leads to union with God, but it can actually also help us with our daily lives. And in particular, devotional practices can help us to quieten the chatter in our minds and reduce anxieties and live more peaceful and fulfilling lives. So I'll explain a little bit about how this is. And I'll start by talking a little bit about the collect, epistle, and the gospel, because as always, these three readings help to set the scene and to provide us with some context about how this intent might fit in. So starting with the collect, we talk about how we thy faithful servants, as in us, continually do worship thee with heartfelt praise and thanksgiving. The word continually is important here because it implies a continuity. What this suggests is that our devotional practices shouldn't just be done on one day, as in we go to church on Sunday and then we forget all about it. Rather, if we want to get the full spiritual benefit from our devotion, and indeed the benefit which I'll describe a bit later in this sermon, we need to be continually doing these things. And this is also supported by our epistle and the gospel. So, starting with the epistle, this one is taken from the book of Revelation, which, as we've discussed the book of Revelation before in many of our sermons, but the important thing to remember about this is that the book of Revelation represents a vision that St. John the Divine had. So, therefore, it's not something that happened in waking consciousness. It's full of imagery, it's full of symbolism, and it is all pitched at a slightly different level of consciousness and at a slightly different plane of reality, so to speak. We're talking about a plane of existence that exists through thoughts and through forms and images. And the particular image and the symbolism that we're talking about in this passage is the image of the saints standing around praising God. In other words, the people who have gotten victory over the beast and over his image and over his mark and over the number of his name. In other words, the people who have defeated the worldly things, who have risen above, who have achieved union with God, are standing around God showing devotion. And again, as in the collects, this is a continuous devotion. It's not just a one-time thing where they praise God, then they go off and do other stuff. They're actually continually praising God. And what this tells us is that this state of divine union is a state where we are continually praising God, and we're not just doing it once and forgetting about it. So this gives us another clue about how this intent of devotion can help us. And lastly, before I actually talk about the practical stuff, I'll talk about the gospel. And the gospel story for today talks about Jesus' conversation with a woman of Samaria. Now, Samaria was a place that was near Jerusalem, but there was a little bit of religious disagreement between the people of Judea and the people of Samaria. And this gospel story refers to it because the woman of Samaria tells Jesus that her fathers, her ancestors, used to worship in the mountain of Samaria, but that now people say that you can only worship in Jerusalem. You have to go to the temple, and that's the only place where you're allowed to worship. And Jesus' response here is that there will come a time, though, where you don't worship God just in the mountain or just in Jerusalem, but rather you worship God worship the Father specifically in spirit and in truth. And he says here, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. So what this tells us is that It doesn't matter where we worship God or what we happen to be doing while we're worshipping God. We need to be worshipping him in spirit. Now, of course, that's not to say that the sacraments and attending church, isn't important and very beneficial for our spiritual growth. But it's not the only thing. If we're just going to church, that's not really going to get us to this state of divine union. We need to actually be doing it continuously and weaving this worship into our daily lives. And as I said at the start, this also has the added benefit of helping us to lead more peaceful lives. If your mind is anything like mine, you'll find that it's constantly needing to do something, always needs something to focus on. And this can be a very useful ability if we're doing something that requires a lot of concentration. But it's both a blessing and it's a curse, because what it means is that if our mind's not doing anything, and if we don't particularly want our mind to be doing anything, like if we're going for a nature walk or if we're just sitting around watching the sunset after a day at work, then our mind tends to make jobs up if it's not given a job. And sometimes these jobs aren't entirely to our benefit. You might have heard the term rumination, where we spend time thinking about things that happened in the past, replaying past events. And often these things can be a bit negative. We might be thinking, I did a terrible job in that conversation or that meeting that I had. I could have said this better. Or we might be worrying and stressing about future events, things that might not even come to pass. I'm not sure what the exact statistic is, but there have been some psychological studies that have been done that have shown that we spend a lot of time worrying about things that don't actually end up happening. We make up scenarios in our heads, and these scenarios never happen. So the time and the energy that we spent worrying about them, it was kind of pointless. It was a bit of a waste of energy. So how can we combat this? What's something that we can do to deal with this? Well, devotion can help us, because we need to let go of our attachment of the things that were and the things that may have been and the things that may be, so that we can get closer to the things that are. And this leads to a very beautiful mystical point about the name of God, which we've discussed in previous sermons, but when Moses speaks to God and asks him what his name is and who he is, God responds with, "I am that I am." So the ultimate expression of what is, the ultimate expression of the present, is God. It's God's presence. And so by doing devotional practices, we are actually getting closer to God's presence, and we're also helping to give our mind a job that isn't ruminating on the past or making up scenarios about the future that are never going to happen. Rather, we are doing something that's actually quite productive for our spirit, and that's also going to be quite good for our blood pressure and our cortisol levels, because devotional practices shouldn't really be causing us extra stress. You don't really get stressed out when you're praying the rosary or when you're doing the Jesus prayer. So how can we apply this in our lives? Well, if you're trying to relax, or you're not really thinking about anything or concentrating on anything, and you find these negative thoughts creeping in, then maybe come back to a little devotional prayer and just bring yourself back to God and to God's presence. And this will be difficult at first, because like any habit, it takes time to form. And we are really in the habit of focusing on negative things and ruminating and being stressed out about things. So over time though, as you do these practices, you'll find that it comes more and more natural, and you'll find that your life will start becoming a little bit more peaceful, a bit more quiet. you won't be feeling as stressed out all the time about stuff. So have a think about these things during this week as we meditate on the intent of devotion. Think about what devotional practices you can incorporate into your life in between trips to church and formal liturgical services, and see how that might enrich your life.